This video has two purposes. The first is to clarify the verb system of ancient Greek in a similar way to what I did with Latin in my last video. The second is to integrate ancient Greek into the theory of Indo-European verbs that I began to lay out in that video, one which essentially takes the Sanskrit system as a starting point and sees how the younger languages differ. That means I'm going to build on the concepts that I tried to explain in the last video, but from the ancient Greek perspective. That said, I will try to keep this one self-contained. It's going to be a pretty thorough look at how all the big parts of the ancient Greek verbal system came together. So, both Latin and ancient Greek verbs are usually taught using the system of principal parts, which seeks to find the minimum number of verbal forms you need to generate any possible form of a given verb. Each principal part is a specific form of the verb, but they're all stand-ins to represent a stem that's used for many different forms. If you know how to say, I am taking, lambano, you also know how to say, I was taking, as well as, you are taking, you were taking, let them be taken, etc. That's the first principal part. The second is, I will take, lepsomai. And from that you get, you will take, we will take, and so on. There are 6 of these principal parts in ancient Greek, 6 different verb forms which, if you know for any given verb, you can theoretically create any possible form of that verb, so long as you know the grammar rules. In the Latin video, I talked about what I call the new system of verbs, a sort of default inflection pattern that many verbs follow, a more or less regular way to derive all the principal parts from a common base. Greek has a parallel to this in verbs like paidewo, which means teach. This pattern and predictable variations on it appears in a huge number of verbs, especially those with basic stems ending in vowels, and especially those that are part of productive formations. What I mean by that is, when an ancient Greek speaker thinks of the word paidewo, they're not thinking, this is the basic way to say teach, simple as that. They're conscious of the fact that this is basically just the verb form of the noun pais, child. It's just that noun stem, paid, plus the common verb suffix ewo. And the answer to the question, how do we form all the different stems, the different principal parts, is what you see here. It's this default pattern. The same verbal base appears in every principal part, with different stem elements attached to it, here in green, as well as in blue all the normal endings that can be changed to denote person, number, and voice, and in the case of the present stem, the difference between present and imperfect. An important contrast is with a verb like lambano, which definitely does not show one consistent base throughout the different stems, and does not necessarily have readily obvious stem markers. So, if all or almost all verbs were like paidewo, there would be no need for principal parts. But most verbs are not like this. Or maybe they are, I haven't counted, but certainly enough verbs, especially common ones, diverge drastically from the default pattern. The variety presented by these 6 verbs alone is enough to see why it makes sense to just memorize everything. Any semblance of a consistent pattern is gone, the principal parts may as well be entirely separate verbs, and in some cases they literally are. That's why principal parts are a fine system for learning Greek and Latin, but it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. Sanskrit verbs demonstrate this. Sanskrit is a classical language from India, and it is also an Indo-European language, meaning it's part of the huge family of related languages that historically covers most of Europe, the Iranian Plateau area, and northern India. It is also one of the oldest Indo-European languages, with some of the Vedic poetry probably dating well back into the 2nd millennium BCE. That's centuries before Homer and classical Greek, which is itself centuries older than classical Latin. The primary goal of Indo-European studies is to figure out how all of these languages developed from whatever their common ancestor was, the so-called Proto-Indo-European. Since it's so old, it's a good assumption that Sanskrit, and particularly Vedic Sanskrit, shows the least amount of change from this hypothetical common ancestor, which is why it's a good starting point. Importantly, Sanskrit is not actually the precursor of Greek and Latin, but from a certain perspective, it's not unreasonable to act like it basically is. Coming back to my point, learning Sanskrit doesn't traditionally involve memorizing principal parts. Instead, what you have is a root syllable, an abstract form which carries the primary meaning of a verb. So for example, the root chid means to cut. From this root, you form stems according to certain formulaic transformations. The present stem, which is essentially the same thing as the first principal part in Greek, is chinadmi, a class 7 verb. I'll explain what class 7 means in a bit, but for now, know that it results from a specific set of simple rules applied to the root. The same rules as in other class 7 stems like unajmi from yuj and pinashmi from pish. There are other stem forms like the aorist, parallel to Greek's third principal part. The aorist is rare and inconsistent in Sanskrit, but inconsistency isn't too much of a problem if you know the grammar rules, since there are only so many formulaic ways to form aorist stems. The aorist achidam is no mystery. It is a thematic aorist formed by the same algorithm as agamam from gam and aruham from ruh. Also attested is the s-aorist achaitsam, with the exact same function but a different form, this time made with the same formula as ashrosham from shru and abharsham from br. And there are a bunch of different stems built directly from the root. Most of them have only one formula that every verb adheres to, but the present and aorist stems specifically have multiple possible options that a root might take. So here's the difference between Greek and Sanskrit. In Greek, you learn actual forms as representations of each stem. These are the principal parts. In Sanskrit, you learn the algorithms that generate the stems. In order to form the present and aorist stems in Greek, you learn, for example, that the first and third principal parts of the word for to take are lambano and elabon. In Sanskrit, you learn that the root for take is gra, and it uses a class 9 present stem and an is aorist. There are irregularities to be sure, but on the whole, the system is describable in a sort of meta-language that is not intuitive for Greek. Conceptually, these are quite different systems, but really the only actual difference is the existence of that abstract root. Greek developed from a proto-language that worked the same way as Sanskrit still does, but over time the effects of sound change made such an analysis increasingly less viable. Still, it's possible to find remnants of every major algorithmic formation that exists in Sanskrit in ancient Greek, and thus to explain and even predict the diversity found in Greek's principal parts. So let's look at the actual formulas. There are 10 regular ways to form a present stem, 10 present stem classes called ganas in Sanskrit, with no difference in meaning between them. I'm going to go through all 10 in no particular order, by which I mean in the narratively convenient order, and explain how each shows up in Greek. And note, what I'm calling the present stem is more accurately the imperfective stem, since fundamentally it's marking a verb as incompleted, not as present tense. There's a past tense imperfective, the imperfect, which uses the same stem but with past tense endings. So present stem doesn't mean the stem used solely for the present, but rather the stem that the present uses among other tenses. Okay. First up are the two simplest present stem classes, classes 1 and 2. The root br, to carry, takes a class 1 present stem, and the root dvish, to hate, takes a class 2 stem. Their actual forms, given in the first person singular active indicative as a sample, are bharami and dveshmi. The most notable thing is the change that happens to the root, a vowel alternation called guna in Sanskrit, which I'll call strengthening. Its exact mechanics are not relevant right now, but know that it's the same process in both verbs. Turning the syllable br into bar is exactly parallel to turning dvish into dvesh. The ending mi appears in both verbs. This is the first person singular present ending, and it should be familiar if you know Greek. The difference is that bharami has this a suffix in between root and ending, while dveshmi just tacks the ending directly onto the root. You'll see the other big difference when I pull up the plural counterparts to these verbs. Switching out the first person singular ending mi for the first person plural ma is all you need to do for the class 1 stem, but for class 2, we see that the root has lost its strengthening. This is because class 1 is what's called a thematic class, while class 2 is athematic. Athematic stems have this vowel alternation where there's a strengthening of the stem final syllable in the singular active indicative, but not elsewhere. This is due to extremely ancient shifts in the placement of accent that still exist in Vedic Sanskrit, but are lost in the classical language as well as in Greek. Class 2 has no suffix at all, so the stem final syllable is just the root, and it's the root that gets strengthened in the singular. Now, you may have noticed the odd change in the second person singular of dveshmi, where the root apparently becomes dvek before the ending shi. This is a regular shift in Sanskrit arising from the interaction between the root final and ending initial consonants. Other such interactions are found in other persons, For example, the third singular ending usually has a dental consonant t, but has become retroflex t because of the root final retroflex sh sound. Again, a regular change, but along with the vowel alternation, it contributes to the reason why in all Indo-European languages, these athematic root stems are very uncommon. They just get really complex and are prone to irregularity. Some of the most common individual verbs in the language are often athematic root presence, because irregular verbs only survive if they're super commonly used, but only a few such verbs tend to exist. On that note, here are the only common active athematic root presence in ancient Greek. Eimi, I am, eimi, I'm going, and pemi, I say, all seriously irregular verbs. If Greek had roots the way Sanskrit does, they would be s, e, and pa. Especially with the latter two, you can see the same singular plural vowel alternation as in Sanskrit. And of these, the first two actually have exact cognates in Sanskrit, which are also class 2 presents, esmi and emi. Greek has a few more of these found mostly in epic poetry, and also a few deponents, like dunamai and kemai. These verbs don't have the singular plural alternation, because that only happens in the active voice, and deponents definitionally don't have an active. Sanskrit has deponents too, and they work the same way. Returning to class 1, this is a comparatively simple and easy class. No vowel alternations, and the theme vowel keeps the root and endings from touching and engaging in shenanigans. Thus, class 1 is the largest present stem class in Sanskrit. It's just very convenient. The one bit of weirdness is that the theme vowel is a long A in the first person, but short elsewhere. And though I'm coloring it in green, it's barely a suffix. It's more associated with the endings, which is why class 1 is still considered a root stem class. This is even more the case in Greek, where the theme vowel has been largely absorbed into the endings, making the suffix no longer extricable. That's why, while in Sanskrit, thematic and athematic verbs both have the same basic set of endings, in Greek we have to talk about athematic endings versus thematic endings, aka endings of me verbs and o verbs. I'm not going to try and explain here how exactly the thematic endings develop from the athematic ones. It's clearly very messy and not fully understood by anyone, but you can see at least in the first and second persons plural how the thematic version is just the athematic version after a vowel, either o or e. By the way, this variation between o and e is related to the variation between long and short a in Sanskrit. So, in Greek, there's a clear tell as to whether a present stem is athematic or thematic in origin. They use a different set of endings. In Sanskrit, the difference is primarily the presence of that theme vowel at the end of the stem, which co-occurs with the absence of vowel alternation. All regular verbs in ancient Greek have thematic present stems, but only a few have thematic root present stems, corresponding to class 1 in Sanskrit. Though simpler than athematic root stems, they have fallen out of fashion in favor of the still easier new system verbs. Here are some of the most common, including a couple deponents. Notice how, though the process of strengthening is not too complicated in Sanskrit, it can have some odd consequences in Greek, such as the loss of the root initial sigma in echo, and its conversion to rough breathing in hepomai. Also notice that some roots, like ag, are unchanged by strengthening. This has to do with the specifics of the process. The root is still technically in a strengthened form, it just happens that for certain vowels, the strengthened form is identical to the unstrengthened form. The same thing happens in Sanskrit, it's normal. So I know that I said classes 1 and 2 were the simplest and then went on several difficult to understand tangents, but I had to lay some groundwork. They are in fact the simplest because there's no real suffix unless you count the theme vowel in class 1. What this means is that the present stem is going to be basic in a way. Other stems built from the same root will usually look like the present stem plus some additional changes and additions. This is kind of the default understanding for a language like English. A verb like want is found in its most basic form in the present tense, while in the past tense, a more complex form is derived by the addition of a suffix. There are two big differences though. First, remember that the so-called present stem also has a past tense, the imperfect, which always uses the same stem as the present tense, just with different endings and the past tense prefix. What the present stem actually marks is the imperfective aspect, which means that we're viewing an event as an ongoing thing with internal structure of some kind, as opposed to the aoristic aspect, which views it as a completed whole, and the stative aspect, which views it as, well, a state, usually one resulting from a previous action. Still, the imperfective aspect is usually conceptualized as the basic one, and it's the only way to form the simple present tense. Which brings me to point number 2, which is that the present stem is not, in fact, always the basic one. Let's contrast the root stem, class 2 dveshmi, with the characterized stem, class 7 chinadmi, from the root chid. The former stem is just the sometimes strengthened root, while the latter has this infix, the syllable na, stuck inside the root. Now, look at the perfect stem for both roots, didvesha and chicheda. Both perfects are formed by the same algorithm, which involves reduplicating the root, strengthening it, and using special endings. While for dvish, you could argue that the present is the more basic or default stem, since it doesn't have any suffixes or anything, whereas the perfect has a reduplication prefix. For chid, both of these stems are radically different from the bare root. Clearly, neither stem is basic. There's no basic stem from which the other is derived. They're related to each other only via the abstract root. So let's take a closer look at class 7, aka the nasal infix class, and how it exists in Greek. I talked about it in my last video, so I'll be briefer here. Like class 2, this is an athematic class, as you can tell by the lack of thematic a vowel before the ending mi. This means that there is vowel alternation in the stem final syllable, which in this case includes the infix na. As you can see, the infix is originally just an n, and it's strengthened to na in the same places where dvish is strengthened to dvesh, i.e. the singular active indicative. And I'll include the middle forms here for good measure. The Sanskrit middle is a lot like the Greek middle in that it doesn't have much of a semantic distinction, especially as time goes on. Morphologically, you can see how the stem is unstrengthened throughout the middle. Now look at the ancient Greek verb lantano, meaning I hide, and its aorist elaton. In the aorist, the epsilon at the beginning is a prefix signifying past tense. It's not a part of the stem, it just co-occurs with the past tense endings, such as on here. It looks like the aorist is essentially just a root with endings, while the present stem has been derived with a nasal infix similar to Sanskrit class 7, along with the suffix an. Besides the strange an suffix, this verb and others like it demonstrate an important trend in Indo-European languages, thematization. As I said earlier, talking about class 2, athematic verbs can get complicated. The vowel and consonant changes are annoying. So there's a tendency to just do away with them and make the verb thematic. That would be kind of hard to do in Sanskrit because it would entail just randomly inserting a theme vowel, but in a language like Greek or Latin where speakers are thinking of the theme vowel as actually part of a set of thematic endings, it's not too much of a stretch to replace the athematic ending set with the thematic one. And along with this comes the loss of the vowel alternation. Typically, we see the unstrengthened variant being generalized, the one that's found in the plural active in Sanskrit, and that's what we see in the nasal infix verbs in Greek. The infix never comprises a whole syllable, it's always just a single nasal consonant stuck right before the root final consonant. As for the an suffix, no one has any idea what it's doing there, one simply learns to accept it. Okay, that's 3 present classes down, 7 to go. Don't worry, it'll speed up from here. In fact, we can take classes 5 and 8 at the same time. They're really just variants of the same thing. Take sunomi from root su and tanomi from tan as prime examples. They are athematic classes. The stem ends in a vowel, but it isn't the theme vowel a, it's u, which gets strengthened in the typical forms to o. So the suffix for classes 5 and 8 are nu and u respectively. You may have noticed that the root tan already ends in n, so the two present stems look identical in formation. In fact, of the few roots which take a class 8 stem, all of them are like this, except for kr, which is pretty irregular in several ways. In short, class 8 is really just a special Sanskrit development out of class 5, and we only really need to look at the latter, with the nu suffix in relation to Greek. There's a group of athematic verbs in Greek with this conspicuous nu suffix found only in the first principal part, the present stem. This includes words like deiknumi, ornumi, and steognumi. The other principal parts of these verbs don't have this nu suffix. Also, the vowel in the suffix actually exhibits the expected sort of vowel alternation for athematic verbs. It's long in the singular active and short elsewhere. Overall, it's very much like the Sanskrit class 5, with the exception that the root syllable itself is, at least most of the time, in a strengthened form in Greek, whereas in Sanskrit it remains unstrengthened. I would attribute this to Greek being silly. A similar case is class 9. From the Sanskrit root kri, to buy, is made the present stem krinami. This is also athematic, and the unstrengthened form of the suffix na is ni, as in plural krinima, we buy. This is a weird vowel alternation. It's not what you'd normally expect based on how the strengthening is supposed to work, but it is what it is. This video isn't about ablaut anyway. The Greek counterpart to this class is verbs like damnami, plural damnamin. In this case, the strengthening is just simple vowel lengthening, followed in the Attic and Ionic dialects by the shift of long a to e. So in that regard, it works just like the deikneumi type. This class is in the process of being thematized in ancient Greek, so we see variants like damnao instead of damnemi, with no vowel alternations. This thematization is also the origin of verbs like kamno as well. So there exists in effect a thematic present stem suffix consisting only of an n, something non-existent in Sanskrit. By the way, if you've noticed that the markers for present classes 7, 5, and 9 all consist of the sound n followed by something else in the stem final syllable, and are wondering if there's a connection, the answer is yes, there is. They're all originally different manifestations of the Proto-Indo-European nasal infix, but the specifics of that will have to wait for another video. Class 3 is an interesting one. The marker of imperfective aspect is here not a suffix nor an infix, but a prefixed reduplication syllable, much like the one used for the perfect stem. Of course, class 3 presents are clearly differentiable from perfects because perfects use special endings distinct from the ones used in the imperfect and present tenses. The classic example is from the root hu, meaning to sacrifice. First person singular juhomi, plural juhuma. And you needn't concern yourself with the consonant changes in the reduplication. I promise it's regular. In Greek, there is a small but important group of reduplicated verbs, including didomi, titami, histemi, along with some rare others. There's some consonant silliness afoot here as well, involving the dissimilation of aspirates and the change of old s to rough breathing. All these verbs show the characteristic athematic vowel alternation. They also differ from the perfect by consistently having an iota vowel in the reduplication syllable, whereas the perfect prefers epsilon. There are additionally some reduplicated verbs that have been thematized, such as mimno, pipto, and the deponent gignomai. These obviously show no vowel alternation and have generalized the unstrengthened root form much like the nasal infix stems. The remaining 3 classes are all thematic. There's class 10, which involves a strengthened root and the thematic suffix aya. This is closely related to the denominal formation, and I'm going to come back to it when I touch on that later. I will also put a pin in class 6, which is actually a root thematic formation, identical to class 1, except that the root doesn't get strengthened. We'll come back to it when we talk about the aorist stems. We will, however, spend some time on class 4, which is vital for understanding ancient Greek verbs. The suffix in Sanskrit is simply ya, attached onto the unstrengthened root. It's not a complicated formula. It's thematic, so there are no vowel changes, and the consonant ya doesn't spark any consonant changes either. This class is extremely prominent in Greek. However, ancient Greek doesn't have the ya sound, because it lost it prehistorically. The ya sound in Proto-Indo-European, while remaining unscathed in Sanskrit, was fully deleted in the interior of words in Greek, but not before leaving a trace on any preceding consonants. All consonants were affected by the erstwhile ya in specific ways, which allows us to reverse engineer the places where the class 4 suffix used to be. And remember, the sign that something is an imperfective marker is that it's only found in the first principal part. Basically, where the stem used to be marked by an explicit suffix, now the marker is a group of alterations to the root final consonant, which I think is really cool. Here's a table showing what each consonant became when followed by ya. There's some weird notation here, so we can look at some examples. The verb pulasso, that's pulato in the Attic dialect, comes from the root pulak. The combination of that root final kappa plus the present stem marker ya has changed from kia to the double sigma. And if you look at the perfect stem, you can still see the root with the unaltered kappa. To comprehensively represent the root of a verb like pesso requires representing a sound that no longer exists in ancient Greek, the labial velar stop que. This is a Proto-Indo-European sound that has various outcomes in Greek depending on the surrounding sounds, including a labial pa and a velar ka. When affected by a following ya sound, the labial-velar qua acts the same way as the ka in pulasso, but the aorist looks more like that of the root krup. This is just because, despite how it acts before ya, before a sa sound, a labial-velar consonant becomes pa. And by the way, the existence of labial-velars isn't a guess. They still exist in Latin, including in the cognate verb coquo. The effect of the y marker on sounds like n was to indirectly alter the preceding vowel, producing an infix-like effect in verbs such as melaino, from the root melan. And in the case of vowels other than a, that vowel simply lengthens. You may have noticed that I assigned a couple of these Greek class 4 verbs to polysyllabic roots, whereas the vast majority of roots in Sanskrit, as well as those using other present classes in Greek, are just one syllable. This is because the ya suffix was, for a while, in both Greek and Sanskrit, a really productive way to make verbs from noun and adjective stems. Pulasso comes from the noun pulax, and melaino comes from the adjective melan. Thus, it's not entirely accurate to call pulak and melan roots. Another word like base may be more appropriate, but that's too complicated, I don't know. After the loss of the y sound, the class stopped being productive since it was no longer clearly a single class, but it did give birth to several new classes of verbs based on nouns and adjectives, a few of which became ridiculously productive. The most important of these is one based on verbs like elpisdo, derived from the noun stem elpid. The d sound plus the y marker becomes a zeta, pronounced like zda, in whatever time period I'm trying to emulate at the moment. For whatever reason, ancient Greek speakers really latched on to isdo as a way to create new verbs, and started sticking it on to pretty much anything, even where it definitely has no business being there, as the stem doesn't end in anything close to id. And that's where the similarly productive ais suffix in English comes from. As for when the verbal root ended in a vowel instead of a consonant, there the y sound disappeared entirely. In most cases, that vowel is part of a nominal stem that's being turned into a verb. And the same story plays out as with isdo, ultimately providing the basis for the vocalic verbs of the new system. I think that's enough class 4 for today. Now, before moving on from the present stem, I want to mention one more imperfective suffix that doesn't exist as a class in Sanskrit, the thematic sk suffix. It's found in verbs like aresco, sometimes appearing as isk, as in heurisco and haliskomai, and sometimes occurring alongside reduplication, as in gignosco and mimnesco. As you can see, the sk bit only appears in the present stem. And a cognate suffix appears in Sanskrit in a few words like gacchami and ichchami, but such forms are irregular even for Sanskrit. Okay, time for the aorist. Luckily, there's a lot less diversity among aorist stem formations than present stems, though they don't have numbers to them. There are only 4 major types, 3 of which have pretty direct parallels among the present stem classes. The first 2 of these are the root aorist stems. Like how the root presents, class 1 and 2, didn't have any substantial markers, these root aorists are just the root plus endings. Albeit in this case only the past tense endings, since aoristic verbs only exist in the past tense. Basically, whereas root present verbs are inherently imperfective, such that simply adding endings to them expresses an imperfective verb, these root aorists are just inherently aoristic. Simply adding endings to them expresses a completed action, a self-contained punctual event. Athematic root aorists are very rare in both Sanskrit and Greek, and neither shows the expected vowel alternation, instead displaying the strengthened vowel throughout. That oddity aside, they closely resemble the imperfect of an athematic root present stem. From the Greek perspective, the thematic root aorists really are identical to the past tense of a thematic root present. The only reason we know egrapon is an imperfect but ematon is an aorist is the relationship to their imperfective stems. Grapho has the same stem as egrapon, but the present corresponding to ematon is mantano, a nasal infix stem, not some mato. Theoretically, the difference may have originally been semantic. Root aorists conveyed notions that are punctual by default, like to find out or to take, whereas root present stems had inherently imperfective meanings, to write or to carry. In practice, the attested languages don't show such a neat distinction, but it's a tempting hypothesis for Proto-Indo-European. That said, there is a real morphological difference between thematic root aorists and thematic root presents in Sanskrit, a language where vowel alternation is still an active and transparent process, even though on a semantic level it doesn't distinguish aspect like ancient Greek. Thematic root aorists always show an unstrengthened root, whereas the thematic root stems of class 1 always strengthen it. However, this is where we circle back to the rare class 6 present stem type, which is the same as class 1 except with an unstrengthened root, causing the same ambiguity as in the egrapon ematon situation, my color coding notwithstanding. A plausible reason for this is that the past tense forms of class 6 were originally aoristic in nature but were reinterpreted as imperfects for whatever reason, and had a present tense back-formed from them. The point is, whatever the case, class 6 is likely an intra-Sanskrit creation, though there are a few Greek thematic present stems with an apparently unstrengthened root, such as the aforementioned grapo. In general, though, root strength is a good heuristic if you know how it works. A good example is lepo, which is exceptional in having both thematic root present and aorist stems, the former of which has a strengthened root and the latter an unstrengthened. Our third aorist class is the reduplicated aorist, and yes, for those keeping track, reduplication can signify imperfective aoristic or stative aspect, don't ask me why. The reduplicated aorist in particular has very strange rules for its formation in Sanskrit that look very little like the others, so they're not easy to confuse. In Greek this is even more the case because they are extremely rare. There's only one reduplicated aorist in common use, which is the aorist of ago, egagon. The fourth and final aorist class is the S-aorist, so called because it has this athematic S suffix added after the root. I'm not going to go into the details of the Sanskrit S-aorist, which gets complicated as it has several subtypes and the vowel alternation gets messy. It's better to focus on the Greek S-aorist, a comparatively simple formation, which is fitting, given that it's the productive aorist formation. So, the S-aorist is the only remaining form in ancient Greek that uses the athematic past tense endings not following a vowel. This causes some weird interactions between root, suffix, and endings that Greek has already completely reformed by the historical period, developing a unique set of endings used only for the S-aorist. They're often called alpha thematic endings because all but the third person singular show this alpha vowel, which essentially serves the same function as the real theme vowel found in the thematic presents and aorists of protecting the stem from the endings that begin in a consonant. Also, despite being technically athematic, the S-aorist has long since given up on any vowel alternation that may have once existed. If built straight from a root and not some denominal conglomeration of the new system, the root normally takes a strengthened form, though there are sometimes some changes caused by the interaction between the S suffix and the root. Most notably, when in contact with the sonorant consonants m, n, r, l, it will disappear and lengthen the preceding vowel in a manner similar to what the class 4 ya suffix can do. In such cases, the unadulterated root is usually still visible in the future, which I'll talk about after briefly going through the perfect stem. There's only one overall algorithm for forming the perfect stem in Sanskrit. It requires reduplicating the root and using a special set of perfect-only endings. Since there's no suffix, this is an athematic stem, so it has vowel alternation. There's a strengthened root in the singular active and unstrengthened elsewhere. There is, however, a subtlety to the alternation, where the root undergoes a sort of double strengthening in the third and occasionally first person singular under the right conditions. I'm not going to go into the reasons why we know the following fact, though I hope to do so in a future video, probably one about English verbs, no less. But this very specific type of variation actually implies that the Greek version of this would involve a special type of strengthening, whereby you get an O vowel where it's normally A. And this is what we see in a group of the oldest perfect stems in Greek. Like with the S-aorist, Greek has stopped with the vowel gradation, generalizing this O-strengthened form to the plural, alongside developing an innovative alpha-thematic set of endings in all but the giga-irregular verb oida. Interestingly, Greek did not extend the O-strengthened root into the middle, the oldest instances of which display the unstrengthened root, as is regular in Sanskrit. This is why the fifth principal part exists. Since vowel alternations are no longer regular in ancient Greek, differences like this have to be memorized. It's made worse by the fact that it's not consistent at all. Many perfect middles copy the root vowel from the present stem even if the perfect active looks different. In any case, the same thing can happen, but in the opposite direction too, with the perfect active copying the present. Basically, Greek considers the reduplication as the primary signal of state of aspect, not any vowel changes. It does utilize a few other alterations though, most notably the kappa suffix, which is of extremely obscure origin, though it must have something to do with the kappa aorist. I haven't mentioned the kappa aorist yet, which only occurs in 3 verbs and also only in the singular active. The kappa perfect is found in the plural, but still only in the active, which is another reason for having the perfect active and middle be 2 different principal parts. The kappa perfect is basically the perfect stem's response to the s aorist, and being the productive type, it makes no particular demands of what the root vowel should look like. It normally copies the present stem. The other notable perfect marker, though much rarer, is an aspiration of the root final consonant. This is an extremely weird thing to do, also of obscure origin, though probably not as old as the kappa suffix, neither of which have any correspondent at all in Sanskrit as far as we can tell. Alright, there are still 2 principal parts left to talk about. To start with, here's a question. Is the future in Greek a tense or an aspect? Semantically, it's definitely a tense, but morphologically it seems to work the same way as the 3 aspect stems. Imperfective markers like the nasal infix don't appear in it, nor do aoristic or stative markers. And there are instead a couple future markers that are added straight to the root. It can also form modal and non-finite forms, which is a property of aspect stems, not tenses. The answer is that the Greek future is a type of imperfective. It's a stem formation on the same level as the nasal infix or the ya suffix, but while those have no inherent meaning other than imperfective, this imperfective stem type has a specialized semantic value, that of future tense. It's closely related to the Sanskrit future, which is formed by adding the suffix sya to the root, except the Greek version is just the sa, no ya, and the root is usually strengthened. Both ultimately come from the Proto-Indo-European desiderative, which forms verbs meaning to want to do something. This is the same semantic development which happened in English with the verb will, which used to mean to want to, but now just creates the future tense. The other variant of the future in Greek, used for roots ending in sonorant consonants, is this eo thing, or just o if we're feeling contractual. This is in origin the same suffix as the sa, if you might indulge me a little laryngeal theory as a treat. In Proto-Indo-European, the suffix included the first laryngeal before the s, a made-up sound that doesn't actually exist in real languages but is very useful for understanding Proto-Indo-European morphology. This laryngeal was deleted after most sounds but remained after sonorants, where it turned into epsilon in Greek. After that, the S sound vanished according to a regular sound law, since it was now between 2 vowels. So that's cool. It also demonstrates that the future suffix is almost certainly unrelated to the S aorist, though they often end up looking similar. The future suffix just comes from a desiderative formation, a secondary imperfective verb which lost its past tense as it was reimagined as a tense form per se. Under this theory, it also kinda makes sense that a lot of futures are middle deponent, even when the present isn't, because you want something for yourself, right? Now we come to the 6th and final principal part, the aorist passive. Unfortunately, this form is very poorly understood. It's usually this te suffix added to the root, occasionally just e. It looks like the root was originally unstrengthened, but it usually copies other forms, especially the normal aorist. There's honestly not much to say about the aorist passive here. It has no obvious cognates in other languages, it's just a strange form that got specialized as a specifically passive aorist somehow, relatively late in the history of ancient Greek. To end, let's look back at what I call the new system, which is analogous in many ways to the Latin verbs of the first, second, and fourth conjugations that have perfect stems with the u suffix. Like these, the Greek vocalic verbs developed mostly from denominal verbs, that is, verbs made from nouns and adjectives rather than from a true verbal root. In Sanskrit, denominal verbs made with the same ya suffix as in class 4 only have imperfective stems, because how would you make aorists and perfects when the verb isn't based directly on a root? But there are some exceptions, cases where the stem was reinterpreted as basic. And this is where class 10 comes from, which uses the suffix aya. That first a vowel is the stem vowel from most nouns, with the class 4 ya added on. This is pretty rare in Sanskrit, but in Greek and Latin too, this is the origin of most verbs. The new system comes mainly from denominal verbs built to noun stems ending in various vowels, combined with a few other pre-existing derivational types. And as the frequency of such verbs increased, speakers eventually felt the need to express more than just imperfective concepts using them. They had to develop ways of forming all the different stems by building them not from a root, but from a whole noun stem. This is the problem that Latin solved with the U-perfect. Of course, while Latin verbs just have 2 stems that come from root-based formations, 3 if you count the past participle, ancient Greek has 6. In Greek, the pattern that won out involves a motley crew of suffixes. The S aorist is here, along with the kappa perfect and the te aorist passive. The only vowel alternation in sight is the fact that the stem vowel, if it's a simple vowel, is short in the present stem, but usually long in the others. There's no single reason for this fact. It arose as a bunch of pre-existing patterns merged into one and got regularized. This is just the pattern that prevailed, and which speakers latched onto as the main way to make new verbs. This is the trend over time in Indo-European languages. The abandonment of the root as the core of the verbal system and the reorientation of conjugation around the present stem, to which elements are added to create the other tenses. Sanskrit preserves a stage prior to this tendency really taking hold, but in ancient Greek it's well along. It is, however, much less progressed than in Latin, and in both languages the old type of verb is still common enough that principal parts are needed to understand how they work. And if you understand where the principal parts come from, they become less mysterious. All the ancient irregular verbs were once new and regular. All it takes to figure them out is knowing what happened in between. Thanks for watching. This video was more dense than I typically want to be, but I just wanted one video where I go through everything. If you want more info about anything, leave a comment and I'll respond. And as always, my main sources are in the description. Bye!